In the dry October of 2003, a 26-year-old woman named Petra Dillard stood at the edge of a spent orchard and listened to the trees die. That is not a poetic exaggeration. If you have ever stood in an orchard that has given up, you know the sound. It is a silence so complete it has texture. No bees, no wind catching leaves, because there were almost no leaves left. Just the skeletal geometry of 60-year-old apple trees, standing in rows like old men who had stopped believing in anything, their bark split and pale, their roots strangling in soil that had been farmed the same wrong way for 4 consecutive decades. Petra had driven 3 hours from Nashville in a truck that burned more oil than gas to look at this place. She had $9,400 in a savings account she had been feeding since she was 19. Waitressing double shifts at a diner outside Murfreesboro, she had a folder of hand-copied notes from her grandmother's kitchen table. And she had an idea that, when she described it to people, made them go quiet in a particular way. Not the quiet of consideration, though the quiet of people deciding how to be polite to someone who has clearly lost their mind. The farm was 38 acres in a low fold of Middle Tennessee, in a county where the soil was a pale, iron-poor clay that crumbled to powder in a dry year and turned to a cold paste in a wet one. A man named Eldon Pruitt was selling it. He was 3rd-generation orchard, and he was done. His grandfather had planted the trees. His father had kept them alive with a regimen of chemical sprays and synthetic fertilizers that had, over time, done exactly what such things do. They had fed the trees while quietly starving the earth beneath them. Eldon himself had spent 15 years watching yields decline and input costs rise until the math simply stopped working. When Petra walked the rows with him on that October morning, he was not a cruel man. He was an exhausted one. He told her the truth about the place without embellishment. The soil pH was wrong. The beneficial fungal networks that healthy orchards depend on were effectively gone, killed off by decades of fungicide application. The trees that were still standing were too old to be economically viable and too compromised to recover. The whole operation, he said, was a slow-motion failure that had been in progress since before she was born. "So what exactly are you planning to do with it?" he asked, when she had been quiet for a while, looking at the trees with an expression he could not quite read. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, not unkindly, "Honey, that's not farming, that's gardening, on 38 acres of dead ground." She bought the place anyway. He took her cashier's check with the practiced neutrality of a man who had made peace with his circumstances. They signed the paperwork on the hood of his truck in the thin autumn sun. As he drove away, she heard him on his phone before he'd made it to the end of the gravel lane. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't need to. "Now, let me tell you something about small agricultural counties in Middle Tennessee. The community of people who farm them is not large, and it is not quiet. Information travels the way water does in flat ground. It spreads wide and fast, and it finds every low place." By the end of that week, the story of the Pruitt orchard sale had made its rounds at the co-op, at the church parking lot, after Sunday service, at the counter of the hardware store where the farmers gathered on cold mornings with bad coffee and confident opinions. The young woman from Nashville, the one who had no farming background, no equipment, no agricultural degree, no family land, nothing but a second-hand truck, and what someone described as a look in her eyes like she knew something the rest of them didn't. She had bought Eldon Pruitt's dead orchard, and what she was planning to do with it when the details filtered through produced a particular kind of laughter. Not mean laughter, exactly. The laughter of people who have watched ideas like that fail before. The laughter of certainty. She's going to do what now? Mushrooms. She wants to grow mushrooms in a dead apple orchard. A pause. Well, at least she'll have something to eat when the money runs out. They were not wrong in the way that people who have never looked at a problem differently are often not wrong about the individual pieces. The orchard was dead, the soil was depleted, and mushrooms, to the conventional agricultural mind of that county in 2003, were not a crop. They were something that appeared uninvited on a log after rain. They were not something you planned a farm around. But Petra Dillard was not thinking about mushrooms the way the men at the co-op were thinking about mushrooms. Let me explain where she had gotten this idea, because it matters. It matters more than the idea itself. Her grandmother, a woman named Ruth Dillard, had kept 3 acres of what she called her messy corner on her property in eastern Kentucky for as long as Petra could remember. It was a corner of old wood that Ruth had never cleared, never tilled, never done anything to, except observe. As a child, Petra had found it boring, just a dark tangle of old trees and fallen logs and leaf matter knee-deep. But her grandmother went there every season, in every weather, and she came back with things. Morels in the spring, chicken of the woods in summer, black trumpets in fall, not enormous quantities, but consistent year after year from the same spots, the same logs, the same root systems. The trees are not dead, Ruth used to say, walking Petra through the mess with a slow, deliberate step. They're just done making leaves. Now they're making something else. She would crouch at the base of a fallen oak and press her palm flat against the wood and leave it there for a moment as if listening. Wood doesn't know it's supposed to be waste. It just knows what the next thing is. Ruth kept a spiral notebook, a different one each year, going back to 1971, full of observations that had nothing to do with profit and everything to do with attention. What temperatures preceded a good morel flush? Which species of tree produced the most productive substrate? How long after a log fell before the mycelium really moved in? How drought years affected fruiting differently than flood years? These notebooks were precise in the way that only genuine curiosity can make a person precise. They were also, to anyone who didn't share that curiosity, completely incomprehensible. When Ruth died in 2001, Petra inherited a cardboard box. Her cousins got the furniture. Her uncle got the truck. Petra got the box, and inside it were 22 notebooks and a handwritten note that said, simply, "Pay attention to what the wood is already doing." Petra had spent 2 years after that, reading the notebooks cover to cover, and then reading them again. And somewhere in the second reading, in the accumulated weight of Ruth's decades of patient watching, an idea had taken shape that felt less like invention and more like recognition, like seeing something that had been there all along. Dead apple orchards produce deadwood. Deadwood is substrate, hardwood substrate. Apple, specifically, is among the very best growing medium in the world for gourmet and medicinal mushroom species. Species that commanded, even in 2003, prices between $6 and $30 a pound at farmers' markets and restaurant supply. And beyond the mushrooms themselves, the mycelium, the vast underground network of fungal threads, would begin over time to do something else. It would begin to digest the old root systems, to break down the compacted clay, to rebuild the microbial communities that 40 years of chemical application had destroyed. The mushrooms were not just a crop, they were the remediation. The farm would heal itself while she harvested from it. One field, one system, 2 functions, time as the operating variable. She knew how it sounded. She had practiced explaining it and watched people's faces while she talked, and she had learned to read the exact moment when their expression shifted from polite interest to careful distance. The first thing she needed, beyond the land she now had, was spawn, mushroom spawn. The inoculated material used to colonize logs and wood chips was not available at the local co-op. She had to mail order it from a small operation in Oregon, and the cost, combined with the chainsaw she bought to begin processing the standing deadwood in the orchard, and the moisture control supplies she needed for her first experimental log piles, took a significant bite from her remaining savings. She also needed to talk to someone about a small operating line of credit. The agricultural loan officer at the county bank was a man named Mr. Hendricks. He had been in that office for 16 years, and he had the settled quality of a man who has seen enough new ideas fail that he has stopped being surprised by the failure. He listened to Petra's proposal, with his hands folded on his desk and his expression professionally neutral, which she had learned to distrust more than open skepticism. When she finished, he asked 2 questions. The first was whether she had any agricultural background. The second was whether she had any documentation of projected yields for specialty mushroom crops from a Tennessee operation of this scale. She did not, on either count. The first was just true. The second was not possible because no Tennessee operation of this scale existed yet. Mr. Hendricks nodded slowly. "Miss Dillard," he said, "I want to be straight with you because I think that's more respectful than sending you home with false hope. What you're describing is an unproven model on compromised land with no comparable local precedent and no collateral beyond the land itself. The land in its current condition does not appraise well." He paused. "My recommendation would be to look at a more established crop rotation for that soil type. Get a few seasons of documented yield history and come back." She asked if he had a recommendation for what established crop would suit iron-poor clay with a pH of 5.2 and no active mycorrhizal network. He did not have a recommendation. She thanked him and left. The second bank gave her the same answer in slightly different language. A representative from the County Agricultural Extension Office drove out to look at the property and wrote a report she later obtained a copy of. It described the operation as experimental in nature, high-risk profile, not recommended for conventional financing. So she did what she could do. She sold her truck. She bought a used one for $100 less than she got for hers. She picked up weekend waitressing shifts again, driving 40 minutes to a restaurant in the next town. She bought spawn in quantities she could afford, which were small. She began to work. The work in those first months was the kind that doesn't look like farming. It looked like forestry or demolition or some combination of the two. She spent weeks with a chainsaw cutting the dead trees into logs of specific lengths, stacking them according to species and diameter, learning through a process of wet trial and cold error the right moisture content for inoculation. Her hands cracked in the November cold. She learned to tape them before she started each morning. She developed a way of lifting logs that put the weight in her legs, because her back had started sending her messages about what it would and would not continue to tolerate. The neighbors on the parish road, the county road, would sometimes slow when they drove past. A young woman alone in a dead orchard, drilling holes in cut logs with a hand brace, hammering in wooden plugs with a rubber mallet, covering the logs in wax with a paintbrush, stacking them in precise rows in the shade of the tree line. It looked nothing like any kind of farming they recognized. It looked, as one farmer later told her, like someone building something very slowly with no plans. Have you ever done a thing that you believed in completely, in the privacy of your own understanding, while being entirely surrounded by the visible doubt of everyone who watched you? Not hostile doubt, patient doubt. The kind that doesn't argue because it doesn't need to, because it is absolutely certain the argument will be settled by time and reality, and not by words. That was the atmosphere of Petra's first winter on that property. She felt it every time a truck slowed on the road. She felt it at the hardware store, when she bought supplies, and the man behind the counter asked what she was doing with so many wax blocks, and she told him, and he nodded in the way of someone who has been told something they don't intend to think about further. She had set her first log piles in November. The spawn needed time, weeks at minimum, often months, to fully colonize the wood before it would fruit. This is not a process you can observe. It happens inside the wood, invisible in darkness and moisture. There was nothing to watch. There was only waiting and maintenance and the continued work of processing more logs and trying not to do the math on how much money she had left and how long it had to last. Spring came slowly that year. March was cold and wet, and then cold and dry, and then wet again. She had driven herself into a habit of checking the log piles in the early morning before she did anything else, the way her grandmother had walked her messy corner in every weather. She was not sure by April what she expected to find. The colonization should have been complete by now. The logs should have been fully threaded through with mycelium, white and dense as fresh bread. But whether anything would actually fruit, and when, and how much, were questions she could only answer by waiting. It was a Wednesday morning in the second week of April. The night had been cool, the air heavy, with the particular damp of spring in Middle Tennessee, the kind of moisture that sits on everything and makes the world smell like beginning. She walked the first log pile with her flashlight in the gray pre-dawn, checking the wax seals, checking for contamination. She almost walked past the first one. It was small, a cluster of pale tan caps, no wider across than her palm, pushing out from between two logs on the east side of the first pile. She stopped. She crouched down. She held her flashlight on it for a long time without moving. Lentinula adodes, shiitake. Her grandmother had described the first flush of a new log as a conversation starting, the wood answering back. She pulled the cluster free. It was firm and cool in her hand, and it smelled of something she did not have words for, something deep and old and alive. She sat down on the cold ground next to the log pile in the gray April morning, and she looked at what she was holding, and she did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry when it worked, because she had been certain it would work, and certainty is not supposed to make you cry. But her hands were shaking. She noticed that. She kept walking. She found 11 more clusters that morning. Not all of them were shiitake. The oyster logs she had set later had already produced a huge pale cream flush she had somehow missed 3 days ago, now slightly past prime but still harvestable. She pulled out the kitchen scale she had brought down to the orchard in anticipation, and she weighed what she had. 4 pounds, 3 ounces. At the price point she had been quoted by a restaurant supplier in Nashville, that was somewhere around $42. It was not a fortune, but the land had answered. The next flush came 2 weeks later, and the next. She learned the rhythm of her specific logs, the way her grandmother had learned the rhythm of the messy corner, which piles flushed early in cold weather, which ones preferred a warm rain, which species came in waves, and which came in trickles. She kept her own notebook, a plain black one. She had bought at a pharmacy, and she filled it in her own handwriting. And sometimes her grandmother's voice was so present in the scratching of the pen that she had to stop and be still for a moment before she continued. By her first full summer, she had established a direct sales relationship with 2 Nashville restaurants that would take everything she could produce. A farmer's market booth in the county seat began moving 15 to 20 pounds on a good Saturday. She had expanded her log yard into a second section of the orchard, 140 logs inoculated and stacked, with another 100 being processed. She was not profitable, not yet, but she had documented yield data. She had purchase orders. She had, for the first time, something that looked on paper like a real operation. In the fall of that year, she went back to see Mr. Hendricks. She brought a folder. Inside it were 6 months of sales records, 3 signed letters of intent from restaurant buyers, a soil test showing measurable improvement in the pH and organic matter of the orchard floor. Since she had begun, the mycelium was working, and a 1-page summary of the economics as they currently stood and as she projected them to grow over the next 2 seasons. He read through the folder without speaking. She watched his face. He was a careful reader, which she had not expected. "These restaurant prices," he said, not looking up. "These are real? Per pound?" "Those are the invoices," she said. He turned to the soil test. He looked at it for longer than she expected. She had included Ruth's explanation of mycorrhizal networks, hand-typed on a single sheet, because she had known he would not understand the numbers without context. He read that too. When he looked up, his expression was different from the one he'd had 2 years ago. It was not transformed. He was not a man who did transformation visibly, but something in the set of it had shifted. The professional neutrality had become something quieter and more genuine. "Miss Dillard," he said. He picked up his pen. "Let's talk about what you actually need." That meeting produced a line of operating credit that allowed her to do in 1 season what would have otherwise taken her 3. She expanded the log yard to 600 logs. She built a simple fruiting house from salvaged lumber and shade cloth. She hired, for the first time, a part-time helper, a 17-year-old from a neighboring farm who arrived each Saturday morning with a thermos of coffee and a willingness to learn that reminded her, painfully and unwarranted, of herself at that age. The farm changed. Anyone who drove past could see it changing, and it took the community time to find the vocabulary for what they were seeing, because it did not look like any farm they had a name for. The dead orchard had become something that was, in the strictest sense, alive. The old apple stumps were colonized and fruiting. The log rows were dense and organized. The air in the orchard, on a humid morning, had a richness to it that was different from the chemical sharpness that had been there when she'd first walked it with Eldon Pruitt. The whispers changed their tone. They went from certainty to confusion, and then from confusion to a grudging, slightly bewildered respect. The woman with the mushroom farm. "Did you hear what she's pulling in?" A farmer at the co-op did the math on her revenue per acre, and then did it again, because the first answer didn't seem possible. She had no tractors. She had no combines. She had a saw, a mallet, and 500 logs. And she was making more per acre than the row crop operations twice her size. She was not insulated from everything. When a late freeze in her 4th year wiped out a significant portion of her spring flush, the loss was real. The financial hit was hard enough that she deferred her own paycheck for 2 months, but she had no debt on the land, low overhead by design, and the mycelium in the logs did not care about a late freeze the way a row crop cares. The network persisted. It waited. It flushed again when the weather turned and the season recovered. In the late summer of her 6th year, she received a letter from the County Agricultural Extension Office. Not the same officer who had written the skeptical report about her operation in 2003. A new one who had taken the position in 2005. His name was Mr. Sorensen, and the letter asked, in careful professional language, whether she would be willing to host a demonstration day at her farm for a group of county landowners who were exploring alternative agricultural models for marginal land. She read the letter twice. She set it on her kitchen table. She looked out the window at the orchard, which was producing in its steady, seasonal, unglamorous way. She thought about the folder of notes she had brought to Mr. Hendricks's office. She thought about her grandmother pressing her palm against a fallen log in the messy corner, listening to what the wood was already doing. She wrote back and said yes. The demonstration day drew 31 people. Some of them were farmers with land problems they hadn't been able to solve with conventional answers. Some of them were curious in the particular way that people who have been wrong about something become curious. One of them was Eldon Pruitt, who stood in the back of the group in clean boots, listening with his arms folded and his face unreadable. He shook her hand afterward. He said, "I was sure this would fail." She said, "I know." He said, "I was wrong." She said, "A lot of people were." She meant it as a simple statement, not a wound, and he seemed to receive it that way. Mr. Hendricks was also there. He did not shake her hand, but he waited until most of the others had gone, and then he walked to where she was breaking down the display tables. And he stood for a moment before he said, "When you came back to see me the second time, I wasn't sure you'd make it back, and then you came in with that folder." He paused. "I should have given you the chance the first time." She looked at him. "Maybe," she said, "but I don't know that I had enough yet the first time. Maybe I needed the 2 years to figure out what I was actually doing." He nodded, slowly, and she thought she saw something loosen in his face. "Still," he said. "Still," she agreed. "If you drive through that fold of Middle Tennessee now, you will see something that was not there before Petra Dillard bought a dead orchard with money she had been saving since she was 19 years old. You will see, on multiple farms, the stacked rows of inoculated logs in the shade of tree lines, and fruiting houses built from salvaged lumber and shade cloth, and hand-lettered signs at the end of gravel lanes advertising specialty mushrooms for sale, a practice that the county extension office, once described as high risk and unproven, has become, quietly and without fanfare, a legitimate part of how this particular part of Tennessee thinks about marginal land. None of the farmers who made that shift would tell you they got the idea from Petra Dillard. They would say they saw the numbers, and the numbers made sense. But the numbers had to exist before anyone could see them, and they existed because one woman decided that a dead orchard was not a problem to be solved, but a system waiting to be understood. Petra still farms the original 38 acres. She has not expanded to hundreds. She does not have employees in the plural. What she has is a farm that produces reliably, costs little to run, and has no debt against it. She has a shelf of black notebooks in her kitchen that now number 11. She has a half-acre of what she calls her messy corner, a section of the orchard she deliberately left unmanaged, where the oldest logs are slowly returning to the soil, and the species that grow there now are ones she didn't plant. She goes there in the early mornings, in every weather, the way her grandmother went to hers. Last spring, her younger sister's daughter came to stay for 2 weeks. She was 13, and she found the farm boring in the way that children find anything boring that does not have a screen. But on the 3rd morning, she followed Petra to the orchard, and she crouched down next to a log, and she was very still for a long time, looking at something that had emerged overnight from the wood. "What is it?" she said. "Oyster mushroom," Petra said. "Second flush from this log. They'll be ready to pull in about 2 more days." The girl stayed crouched, looking. "How did you know it would grow there?" Petra thought about how to answer that. She thought about Ruth's voice in the scratching of a pen. She thought about a hand pressed flat against a fallen log, listening. "I paid attention to what the wood was already doing," she said. The girl looked up at her, then back at the mushroom, and in that silence, something passed between them that did not need to be said, and that Petra would not have been able to say even if she had tried, because the right words for it had already been written, in spidery handwriting, in a notebook, in a cardboard box, 20 years before either of them had any idea it mattered.